Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TFI Let's Talk. And today we have with us Lukas Gentele, co-founder and CEO of Loft Lab. Lukas, first of all, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
First of all, tell us a bit about the Loft Labs. What is the company all about?
Yeah, so essentially, we started Loft Labs to build a multi-tenancy solution for Kubernetes, enable developers to really, in a self-service fashion, work together in shared Kubernetes clusters, and essentially boosting developer productivity with Kubernetes, while at the same time, having these secure controls for the central platform teams, like, cost control and secure multi-tenancy. That's essentially what we're working on.
When I see what Loft Lab is doing, a lot of other companies are already kind of offering, similar solutions, similar technologies. Of course, you folks are doing everything open source. So are you looking at a specific problem, or you are looking at a specific use case or a specific market with Loft Lab?
We're really looking at a specific use case. We're really looking for, the shift left movement, essentially enabling individual developers to get access to Kubernetes. Most of the solutions out there that concern Kubernetes management are really designed for operators in mind, right? It's about, running large-scale clusters and really, having hundreds of these clusters, upgrading them, etc. We're not doing that at all, right? You cannot create a Kubernetes cluster in EKS with our product. It's not possible. You have to manage it with, Ranch or OpenShift or any of the other great products out there. And then you connect it to Loft to then enable self-service for your developer teams. And that kind of, gives you this next step in Kubernetes adoption in, boosting adoption from just, 10 sysadmins and operators having access to Kubernetes to really 1,000 or 2,000 engineers in your organization now being able to work with Kubernetes directly, unimpeded, without the CI/CD pipeline in the way.
Right. You mentioned shift left, and you mentioned CI/CD, and CI/CD, or continuous delivery, is kind of playing a very big role. Especially when you also look at GitSop. Because everything from security to compliance to is kind of becoming part of developers' pipeline. It's not someone else's problem anymore. So to talk about, at the same time, when we do look at the cloud native landscape, it is also getting very, very complicated. There are so many, not only knobs to turn, there are so many pieces, so many open source projects that you're pulling in there. So how are you making it easier for all those customers who are already shifting left, or you are also encouraging them to shift left and also kind of streamlining their CI/CD pipeline?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So originally, we actually started with an open source project called Devspace, which is a client-only developer tool. That was even before, we started the company. And, with the initial success of Devspace kind of being, we were number 3, Kubernetes development tool back in 2018, and really addressed the developer themselves rather than the operator. So if you had a Minikube cluster, you could streamline your workflow with Kubernetes. And we still believe in kind of this approach of having these smaller solutions rather than this one holistic platform that sucks everything in. That's why we're also open sourcing different other components. We open sourced Kiosk last year, which was part of Loft. And now we're open sourcing our virtual cluster technology, which is currently part of Loft and will now be its independent own virtual cluster project. So that, if you're an enterprise and you're interested purely in virtual clusters, you can take that open source project and just, roll with that rather than having to, commit to the entire tool suite that we're offering.
Yeah, I want to go deeper into the weeds of Vcluster or the virtual cluster technology. First of all, tell me a bit about the need of this technology at this point, and then let's go into details. What does it do?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think the current boundary for, isolating people in a shared Kubernetes cluster and really establishing that kind of cluster multi-tenancy is currently the construct called Namespace, right? Essentially, companies create namespaces for individual users. They create namespaces for different teams in the organization. And with Vcluster, it is now possible to provision real Kubernetes clusters to these users rather than just namespaces. And the big need for real clusters rather than namespaces is just the limitations that namespaces have. Think about it this way. If you're sharing a Kubernetes cluster, on a per namespace basis, like a lot of companies are doing today, then as an operations team, you need to isolate those namespaces, right? You need to isolate your tenants so that they don't get in the way of each other, even if they may not be malicious actors. People delete things accidentally, right? Or people spam the Kubernetes API server, take up all the resources. So you need to limit what your users can do in those namespaces. However, that takes a lot of power away from them. Just think about all these cluster-wide objects that you cannot access in a shared multi-tenant cluster that uses namespaces. For example, custom resource definitions, right? Those CRDs are everywhere now, right? Whether you install a new machine learning framework or anything that Ranch or we are working on, everything is based on CRDs. As a developer, if I'm not able to install my MySQL database now or my new machine learning framework that I want to try out because I don't have access to these CRDs, I'm essentially kind of reverted back to having to run to the admin to ask for permission, and the admin is in the unfortunate position to have to maintain the software for you, which is really not what Shift Left should be about. And Virtual Cluster, and especially Vcluster, our product, is designed to be so easy, kind of like an plug-in replacement for namespace that actually runs on top of regular namespaces within a Kubernetes cluster.
In the cloud native world, the early adopters of Kubernetes were the one who, those companies were like tech companies. They used to evaluate all these latest technologies. Today, almost everybody wants to leverage these very complicated, complex, hard to manage technologies. But at the same time, especially because of this pandemic, it has becoming increasingly important for companies to have their digital transformation journey, their cloud journey. Everybody, if you're not in cloud, you will not survive. So there's a kind of rush or kind of acceleration towards that, which is also kind of, as you mentioned, ease of use. There is an increasing focus on how easy things are. That's why we also hear things like low code, no code, even from established companies. Can you talk about what kind of pattern you are seeing? Because the company is also relatively new. It's 2019. Within these 2 years, how you have seen the way people are consuming all these cloud native technology like Kubernetes, where you do feel that, hey, you know what, we do have to simplify things. Now, there is one problem that I see is that as we oversimplify things, we also kind of create a breed of developers who really don't know the weeds of technology. They always sit on the surface. That also create a generation of users. I mean, by users, I do not mean end user, but developers who are not very well versed with the technology, and that might make things even more complicated. Which means there will be a rise of platform where things will become more and more platform, and they will be iOS kind of developers where they don't have access to that. So talk about while you are trying to simplify things, but you are also kind of changing the culture there. So it's a complicated question, but I am sure that you have some good answer there.
Yeah, I think one thing that we kind of always keep in mind there's this whole movement towards Kubernetes is stable enough now. It's not like in the beginning everybody wanted vanilla Kubernetes, right? They were like, no, we're running Kubernetes ourselves on top of AWS and not using EKS, their managed service, right? Which is insane if you think about it, right? You could get that managed service and all that, comfort that it offers free, essentially, or just for minimal, cost overhead. And I think the movement towards abstracting Kubernetes and kind of using these higher level system is definitely clearly visible. I think what is important to keep in mind compared to the actual, platform as a service trend is that most people that really understand the space do not try to hide Kubernetes because nobody wants to have this new lock-in into, this one abstracted platform that has its own language. So when you're looking at our, open source project DevSpace and even Vcluster, right, all of what we're doing happens inside Kubernetes, and you actually need to. So, I mean, when you're creating a vCluster with our CLI, under the hood, it runs kubectl commands. So the developer can run these commands themselves, right? The same as DevSpace that, kind of deploys your application and does hot reloading for your application within a Kubernetes cluster. That is basically under the hood running Helm and kubectl and Kustomize, right? You could run those things yourself, which is very important in terms of understandability. But it's also important, when you're actually hitting the limits of a tool, because that tool will be extendable now. If your organization needs to change a couple of things, if your developer actually needs to run kubectl exec and stream the logs of an individual container, they can still do that with kubectl because we're not hiding anything from them. We're just making it easier in their day-to-day life. 99% of their tasks, they will be using higher level tools, but the 1% where they need to dig deeper, right? Nothing should be in the way of a developer to actually dig deeper. And I think that's the huge difference compared to platform as a service, and I don't think we should go back down that road.
Right. Also, I mean, not only your, the brain power plus your time, you have limited of those. You should not waste that time in plumbing a lot of things. You should use that time to add value to your business application. So let that plumbing or other stack things or challenges to someone else. You also mentioned vendor lock-in. You also mentioned open source, and you have your open source company. You have also open source Vcluster. So first of all, talk about the importance of open source in today's cloud native world, where unlike early days of LAMP stack, you are not running anything locally unless until you are on-prem. So talk about the importance of open source in today's world.
Yeah, I think especially everything, in the CNCF environment, we see the huge conferences like KubeCon, right, which are kind of, which really demonstrate the power of community. And I think that's what open source really is about. It's about different opinions coming together and actually shaping a better product in the end, right? Not everybody may be an actual code contributor, but there's people that open issues. There's, an ongoing conversation about things. There's an open roadmap, right? Open governance for project, which CNCF clearly, is a champion at in the space. I think that those things are very, very important. They just make everything that we're working on more valuable because of all of this input. And that's why we also decided to open source Vcluster, because we had Vcluster as part of Loft, and our customers are using Vcluster today, but there's a broader need for virtualization technology in the Kubernetes space, and we see the SIG multi-tenancy, the working group multi-tenancy in CNCF is also, looking into how Vclusters work. And they reached out to us in December. We had a joint call, but unfortunately our product was not open source yet, right? So these conversations get much harder when you're not free to talk about everything, right? Now we open source Vcluster, and the first thing we're going to do is go back to the multi-tenancy group and talk about how we can join forces on certain things, because that makes a lot of sense, right? It's just better to work on joint projects together than every company building their own solution.
Lukas, thank you so much for taking time today and talk about these open source projects. And I look forward to talk to you again. Thank you.
Sure, definitely. Thank you so much for having me.